I'm Teresa Carraggio, and this is Third Paradigm. Today I'm talking once again about James Corbett and Matt Ehret, and I'm calling this Multipolar versus Micropolar. So I think that the most important question to ask before you embroil yourself in any argument, not that that's what this is what difference does it make? Where would it change anything about what you do? In this case, I think the fundamental difference between their ideologies is that Matt is looking at a multipolar world, one in which you have large nations, up to 1 billion people, and that they are negotiating and they're making trade deals and they have their elected leaders who are deciding what kind of development projects to do together. And then the other one, which I think James Corbett represents, I'm calling a micropolar world. It's one that could be called anarchy or horizontal governance, as Tom Osher does. So I want to look in more depth at that, and you can decide which of these strategies for the future do you want to use for your research, for your voice, and to apply your imagination. Let's look at this. No matter what our position on a multipolar world, there is no doubt that it's happening and that it will be beneficial to all of those countries that the US, the UK, the IMF have under their thumb with things like debt and restructuring and currency manipulation, all those things Tom would call the economic hitmen. But what is it going to mean to those of us who live under the dollar hegemony and who are dependent on the things that other people produce because we are a consumer country overwhelmingly? So does the heterogemony, a word I invented to be the opposite of hegemony, does it stop there? Or is that something that can trickle down and continue to become more micropolar? Because right now China is owning a lot of U.S. Treasury bills that may become kind of useless except for buying things like U.S. real estate, U.S. corporations, and U.S. resources. So do we need a plan to be able to protect our assets? Tom publishes on YouTube as M of Wufu, and he commented on my last video that he's a fan of all of us. He's interviewed Matt and asked some really good questions about whether authoritarian countries can be trusted. He wrote, "While appreciating greatly the work of Cynthia and Matt, I have to align more with James Corbett after watching your video, since I too am a longtime grassroots radical anarchist activist. I am involved in Ecuador with promoting the idea of horizontal governance and getting all the indigenous nations of Ecuador and all of the campesino villages to agree to the single demand of horizontal governance for Ecuador, all of whom we're in touch with. And on Substack, I've also linked a really nice video on horizontal governance. And I think that horizontal governance could be a great phrase for Kennedy, which has a lot less baggage to it than anarchy." And then Matt very kindly watched my video and responded. He wrote, "On C.S. Lewis, I actually never wrote anything about him. My wife has done extensive work on his work exposing transhumanism and has delivered dozens of lectures on this topic, which includes critiques of his naive idea of Christianity and women, which Cynthia demonstrates he was not consistent in, either due to his adoration of Joy, who he calls his teacher and sovereign. Her most concentrated work on Lewis is found in Part 3 of her trilogy of lectures on Lewis's Science Trilogy, where she also deals with Lewis and the Bible's troubled view of women. So I'm looking forward to seeing that because Cynthia is definitely the counterexample to C.S. Lewis saying that women do not belong in the world of ideas." And then Matt continued, even though you like Franklin, whom I also admire immensely, you mistakenly assert that he didn't want a big government, and that his 1729 work on paper currency works in our age. Franklin recognized that it didn't even work in Franklin's time because a centralized international deep state of the British Empire destroyed every attempt to get a locally controlled currency, manufacturing, etc. Franklin dealt with this crushing of his efforts by organizing the American Revolution, and then spearheaded the 1787 Constitutional Convention, which enshrined powers of central government in the preamble and throughout the Charter. This was not because he created a fascist system, but because he knew that a symmetrical power is needed for defense-offense against an enemy that wants to destroy you. I wrote Clash of the Two Americas, Volume 1, featuring chapters on Hamilton, breaking down all the popular narratives of Hamilton as a banker's agent who created a debt-slave system. It ain't true. I wrote several more chapters breaking down FDR's work in Volume 2, and then breaking down similar anti-FDR myths. I answered Matt by saying I think there's two different questions. One is what economic system will work logistically in terms of doing what it is you want it to do. And the other is which one will work politically in terms of what they'll allow you to do. I look only at the first question because I think the second question is out of our control. But if things collapse, it may be something we have an opportunity to implement, and I think we should be prepared by knowing what it is that works logistically. In my book, How to Dismantle an Empire, I have a chapter mostly devoted to Franklin and his system of colonial scrip, which was so successful that when he went before the British Board of Trade and told them that they could eliminate poverty in Europe and all of the dismal things that he saw in Ireland, because in Pennsylvania there were no poorhouses. People all had clothes, mostly of their own making, that people didn't go hungry, and that everyone who wanted a job had one. They were so appalled by that they passed the Currency Act of 1764 outlawing colonial scrip. So I don't think that was something that showed that it didn't work. And then he said, Franklin, that was the cause of the American discontent that led to the Revolutionary War, that it wasn't just a little tax on stamps or on tea. I don't believe that there's any evidence that he was instrumental in forming the Constitution and calling that convention. That all happened in Baltimore at the instigation of Hamilton, who had written the entire act that he tried to get passed as the Constitution before then, and he couldn't get it past Congress. He ended up withdrawing it because it was such a dismal response. So it wasn't until he did this trick that it ended up calling for this convention. And I outline all of that in my episode called The Constitution Coup. So I'll link that at the end. In fact, if Franklin hadn't gotten sick and arrived a day late to the convention, he probably would have been the one to lead that, and I think that everything could have turned out very differently. As it was in his closing remarks, he said that he thinks the government will end in despotism when the people should become so corrupted as to need a despotic government, being incapable of any others. And he promised not to whisper a syllable of the opinions that he had of its errors, saying, "Within these walls they were born, and here they shall die." On my last episode on Matt and James, Helene Baloney posted, "I have not read Mr. Corbett. I only heard of him mentioned by someone recently, and it was not in a favorable light. This was a great show, long but worth it. And then she gives a link to a commentary by Matt Ehret, who I admire, and his co-host Gorilla V, who I find prone to ridicule, which he did in this episode regarding Catherine Austin Fitts. He said that she had no financial background from HUD, so her let's go local was pie in the sky. Gorilla V says that he is an investment banker who deals with rare metals and hedge funds. But Fitts and James Corbett are just reading off each other's tea leaves, have no new ideas, and repeat things with no gravity or veracity or knowledge of what they're even talking about. And then Matt said that Fitts and Corbett are both devoutly influenced by a philosophy developed by the Habsburg elites in Austria. The American Revolution, he maintained, was fought to break America free of ideas like Adam Smith's that makes using government to do things evil because you're infringing on the free market. Adam Smith sees liberty as the ability to do whatever the hell you want without responsibility. But then I was informed by a reader, Newsfera, that the rift goes much deeper. James Corbett's episode, which is titled "Shocking Document Reveals Trudeau's Real Plan," halfway through reveals the ruse. Everything that's supposedly written by Trudeau is actually from Putin, detailing his agenda in line with the Great Reset. He goes on to list 10 points to support his thesis that Putin is a global leader in the WEF, was brought to power by his close ties to Kissinger when he was an unknown taxi driver, is a warmonger, has cracked down on all criticism of government or the war, admires China's dictatorship, enforced vaccine mandates, and so on. Corbett's conclusion is that Putin is phase 2 of the Great Reset, a coordinated 1-2 punch to bring about the renamed New World Order. And then Matt posted, "Are Russia and China in on the Great Reset? My response to James Corbett." He wrote, "The willingness to believe that every nation is controlled by a sociopathic oligarchy out to kill us is tied to a deep cultural sickness of nihilism, pessimism, and the belief that humanity is intrinsically corrupt and doomed. That level of cynicism is attractive partially because it alleviates each of us from having to take responsibility for righting injustices or risking our personal security in order to intervene upon an evil, self-destructive system. For how could we make something good which is evil by its very nature? This cynical way of thinking also appeals to our tendency to wish to remain voyeurs, watching and commenting upon reality as if each of us were not also integrated into the system which we were voyeuristically trying to watch as if it were reality TV." Now, reading that, I think that you have to be willing to consider anything. You have to be willing to look at reality and lead wherever the facts go to their conclusion. If you don't, I don't know, you're still some kind of blue-pilled. Maybe you've got a tinge of red, maybe you're periwinkle-pilled, but you're not really willing to say, what are the facts? What is it out there? And I also don't know if there's a difference between what James and what Matt are doing in terms of risking themselves and putting themselves out there to change things. They both seem to be, cyber warriors sending out missives from their book-lined bat caves, as are we all. And then Roosevelt, who they both have made episodes on. Matt has written FDR and Keynes, and makes the point that FDR stood up to the British bankers and was not a follower of the eugenicist Keynes. He ends with these telling quotes. Galton's eccentric, skeptical, observing, flashing, cavalry leader type of mind led him eventually to become the founder of the most important, significant, and I would add, genuine branch of sociology which exists, namely eugenics. John Maynard Keynes on Galton's Eugenics, Eugenics Review, 1946. I do not agree that the dog in a manger has the final rights to the manger, even though he may have lain there for a very long time. I do not admit that right. I do not admit, for instance, that a great wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America or the black people of Australia. I do not admit that a wrong has been done to these people by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, a more worldly wise race, to put it that way, has come in and taken their place. Winston Churchill to the Peel Commission. There has never been, there isn't now, and there never will be any race of people fit to serve as masters over their fellow men. We believe that any nationality, no matter how small, has the inherent right to its own nationhood. FDR in 1942. They who seek to establish systems of government based on the regimentation of all human beings by a handful of individual rulers call this a new order. It is not new, and it is not order. Again, FDR. And then James Corbett has written about Roosevelt and sanctions as warfare. And as I've written before, I think that that's actually terrorism because it's indiscriminate. So I think war would be an upgrade. What he writes about is the German starvation blockade and then goes on to the Japan oil embargo of FDR. At the outbreak of World War II, FDR was faced with a dilemma. Understanding that the conflict represented the perfect opportunity for America to emerge as the world's unrivaled superpower, he was eager to embroil the United States in the war. The American people, however, realizing just how thoroughly they'd been had by the War Propaganda Bureau and other underhanded efforts to convince Americans to enter the First World War, were decidedly against U.S. entry into another bloody European struggle. As we now know from the diligent research done by Robert B. Stinnett, author of Days of Deceit, The Truth About FDR and Pearl Harbor, the road to Pearl Harbor began in October 1940 when Lieutenant Commander Arthur H. McCollum, head of the Far East Desk of the U.S. Office of Naval Intelligence, drafted an 8-point memo under the innocuous heading Estimate of the Situation in the Pacific and Recommendations for Actions by the United States. Far from a stuffy bureaucratic document, the memo, in Stinnett's words, called for virtually inciting a Japanese attack on American ground, air, and naval forces in Hawaii, as well as on British and Dutch colonial outposts in the Pacific region. Specifically, McCollum's memo advised President Roosevelt to, among other things, keep the main strength of the U.S. fleet, now in the Pacific, in the vicinity of the Hawaiian Islands. Insist that the Dutch refuse to grant Japanese demands for undue economic concessions, particularly oil, and completely embargo all trade with Japan, in collaboration with a similar embargo imposed by the British Empire. As Stinnett documents, beginning the very next day after the submission of the memo, with FDR's involvement, McCollum's proposals were systematically put into effect, and provoking Japan into an overt act of war became the principal policy that guided FDR's actions towards Japan. Precisely how this plan was put into effect is likewise a matter of public record. For those who are unfamiliar with that story, Corbett documents FDR's subsequent steps down the path to Pearl Harbor in debunking a century of war lies. So if FDR wasn't a Keynesian eugenicist, he was still a warmonger willing to sacrifice American lives for a global hegemony. And I also really recommend reading Adam Hochschild's Spain in Our Hearts for how FDR refused to sell weapons to the legitimate Spanish government that was in exile in Catalan and therefore allowed Franco, the fascist dictator, to come in and crush them. I have never read anything more heartbreaking. And I'll end with a quote from Immanuel Kant's What is Enlightenment in 1784. This was contributed by Jeff, saying, I think this may resonate with many here and remind us that we're dealing with age-old problems. Kant writes, laziness and cowardice are the reason why so great a proportion of men gladly remain in lifelong immaturity, and why it is so easy for others to establish themselves as their guardians. It is so easy to be immature. If I have a book to serve as my understanding, a pastor to serve as my conscience, a physician to determine my diet for me, and so on, I need not exert myself at all. I need not think, if only I can pay. Others will readily undertake the irksome work for me. And these days, we really need to upgrade that book to something far less taxing. Both Matt Ehret and James Corbett require us to think and give us ample fodder to do it with. And that's always going to be a good thing, whether we agree or not. And for more on these topics, here's the Constitution Convention coup, and this one is Putin's piece, Petrodollar Pain. Thank you for watching.